In this module, we'll talk about morphemes and distinguish them from words. So that difference between morphemes and words is an important part of our content. We'll talk about monomorphemic versus multimorphemic words, and you actually see some morphology even within those words themselves. We'll see ways of dividing up morphemes into content versus function morphemes or bound versus free morphemes. And we'll talk about the difference between morphemes and allomorphs. You should recognize the eme part of the word morpheme from our idea of phoneme, and the allo part of the word allomorph from our idea of the word allophone. Okay, so morphemes are the smallest indivisible units of meaning within any language, and every human language has them. You could think of it as like these Lego blocks, the basic building blocks. So I can take something apart into these building blocks. I could take apart a Lego castle or a Lego house, but I can't take those blocks apart any further. If I were to break them, they would no longer work. That's the smallest indivisible unit of a structure that I've built out of Legos. And some are short, like this little one Lego guy. Some are actually bigger, like I have this 2x8 block there. And there can be very small morphemes that are a single sound or even just a single suprasegmental feature. Or there can be very long morphemes that are many, many vowels and consonants long. But I can't break it out any further and have those pieces mean anything. Let's think of the morpheme cat. And we actually distinguish that I'm talking about a morpheme because it's inside a double diagonal slash. And what we put in the morpheme as we're describing it is often the way that it's spelled in that language. But again, because it's an eme, a morpheme, it's just a mental idea. It doesn't matter so much what we put in there. So this word morpheme cat has the meaning of an animal, a feline animal. This may not be the exact cat that brought to mind, but once you see this exemplar of a real cat, you realize like, oh, I could use that morpheme cat to describe this animal. And this morpheme cat is actually made up of phonemes. So most morphemes are made up of phonemes. In order to talk about this animal with a single word like that, I would need a k phoneme, an a phoneme, and a t phoneme. And then when I would go to actually pronounce these phonemes, this mental idea of the phonemes which are underlying this morpheme cat, maybe it would come out of my mouth with this aspirated k and this unreleased t. So this would be the phonetic transcription cat. This would be the morphemes underlying it. It's made of some kind of a k sound, some kind of an a sound, some kind of a t sound, and then this would be the morpheme itself, the thing that means this sort of four-legged feline animal. It's important to remember that morphemes aren't words, even though the one that I just showed you, this morpheme cat, is also a word. So this word can be made of a single morpheme. It's a monomorphemic word. A word can be made of more than one morpheme. So in the word cats, which I would write C-A-T-S, it can be made up of this morpheme cat, which means this animal, but there's another morpheme at the end, s. I could pull apart that sort of word into two Lego pieces. This is the piece which means the animal. This is the piece which means plural, and it would always go at the end. Or a more complex word, even like cat sitter, I would still have the same morpheme cat, the animal. Sitter itself could actually be divided into two. There's this ending er, meaning sort of the person who does something, and then there's sit, which has a couple different meanings. We call this polysemy. One meaning is actually to not stand, but to put your bottom on a chair or something. In this case, though, sit actually means something like to watch. So like a sitter is a watcher or someone who takes care of something. So cat sitter actually can be pulled apart into these three Lego blocks, three different bits of meaning, and these are all morphemes. Another example of this, a three morpheme word, a trimorphemic word would be the word sleepily, which would mean all as a whole if I were to look it up in a dictionary to do something in a tired way. And you notice that dictionary entry can have more than one morpheme in it. So this word has three morphemes. Sleep, which means something like zzz, like to fall asleep. This is the way it's represented. There's another morpheme which is sort of a y suffix, which is sort of confusing when we look at this because I actually don't mean this y, I mean this y here. This one, its meaning is to take any noun and to turn it into an adjective, which means now I have properties of that kind of noun. So a sleepy person would mean something like someone who has some properties or some relationship to the noun sleep. So sleep plus E, actually that combination of those two together would mean to be a person or a thing that wants to sleep, or to be a person or a thing in need of sleep. Then there's this other suffix which I put next, li. So I actually have sleep, sleepy, sleepily. And I don't write sleep Y-L-Y. We have this weird spelling rule in English that it would be sleep I-L-Y. This is a challenge, and you can actually see that the same morpheme might have more than one spelling. This one that shakes a noun, turns into an adjective, could be spelled as a Y or spelled as an I. Probably in terms of the phoneme underlying it, it would still be an E, and then if it's an unstressed position like here, it would get reduced to being an I. So morphemes are a single sound to meaning correspondence. It could be a single sound, it could be a stretch of sounds, but that group of sounds, that sort of noise that I could pick up with a microphone, has a predictable, has a clear meaning. What a morpheme is, the definition of a morpheme remains the same from language to language. Every human language is made of morphemes. It's a stretch of sound that cannot be divided into more than one meaningful piece. Now, words, we saw, could be a single morpheme, could be multiple morphemes. And what a word is actually greatly differs from culture to culture and language to language. We think of words mostly as something that has a space in between them, things with spaces between them in writing. And it turns out that the idea of what is a word is sort of a non-obvious word. Words sort of came into great consciousness when literacy was invented. So we saw that a dictionary is a written list of words. And the words that I could be looking up, a word like sleepily or even sleepy, could have more than one morpheme. Luckily, our brain actually doesn't behave like a dictionary. We have what we call a lexicon. A lexicon is a mental list of morphemes. And even though language learners might bring their dictionaries to class, what I really care about as a language teacher is making sure that their brain is full of the full list of morphemes that are used by the language, that they have that mental lexicon. And your brain saves a lot of energy by only storing morphemes, because the language will have far fewer morphemes than it will have words. So if you have just the morphemes of a language, and then you have some predictable rules that you could use to combine those morphemes into these words, into these combinations, you can save a lot of energy. So a dictionary would have far more entries in it than someone's mind actually would have. So in a word like unoffensiveness, we have a morpheme un, which is a prefix. It attaches at the beginning of the word. This thing in the middle is actually the morpheme offend, which means to make someone angry or to attack them or, to do something aggressive. It could have a lot of different meanings that I could describe, which we already see. How would a baby come to know what offend means? We also have to realize, a baby would have to come to know, or a language learner, that the string of sounds, which is pronounced offense in the word offensiveness, actually has the same meaning as the string of sounds pronounced offend in the word itself, the verb offend. So we see that the same morpheme can have more than one pronunciation, actually. This iv ending is a suffix that attaches at the end, which would mean something like in the manner of something. It will take a verb and it will create an adjective, and then ness, kind of the quality of that thing, or the abstract quality of having that adjective, of having that characteristic. So offend is to make someone angry. Offensive would be to do something in a way that makes people angry. Offensiveness would be something, having the attribute or the characteristic of being an offensive person. Then unoffensive would be something that doesn't make people angry. Unoffensiveness would be having the quality of not making people angry. So what is stored in our mental lexicon? If it's not the same as a dictionary, what do we have to learn? As a learner of language, what do we have to acquire and have in our brain ready to go? Let's look at this list of words. Walk, walking, walks, walked, walker, walkathon, walkaholic. Would I have to learn each of these words separately? And would I have to learn walker separately from hunter, separately from driver? and walk are also separately from walked and walks and walking. How many entries would I need for a word sleeper? Is it an entry in and of itself in my lexicon, or is it something that I can put together out of the two pieces? Well, let's think about this. We saw that actually our mental lexicon stores morphemes, a list of morphemes, the smallest pieces of word which carry their own meaning. So walk, I can't break up anymore, so I have walk. So to get the word walking, I don't actually need to store the word walking. I could just have the word walk and then ing, or the morpheme walk and the morpheme ing, and I can put that ing together with lots of other things, hunting, driving. Same thing here. I don't need another entry for walks. I can use the entry I already have for walk, and then I have another entry for s, which could be a plural. Maybe it's that third person singular, he walks. And past tense ed, this er, an entry a-thon or aholic, so I can have a workaholic, I could have a walkaholic, I could have a danceaholic, I could have a workathon or a danceathon. So it turns out I can actually save time by just storing each of these endings separately and storing what we call the root, the thing to which these endings, these affixes, these prefixes and suffixes attach separately. So I can actually cover the same ground or generate the same quantity of words by having fewer things stored in my mind. Sleeper, if it was a person who's sleeping, sleep plus someone who sleeps. But what about the idea of a sleeper car? In a train, like, oh no, I left my coat in the sleeper. That wouldn't make sense if sleeper is derived just from sleep, the verb, and person who does that. How could I leave my coat inside the person who is sleeping? So now sleeper has taken on a new meaning, which obviously has a relationship to the previous meaning. A sleeper car is a place where people do sleep, and you stopped kind of saying car and just called it a sleeper or the sleeper. How many sleepers does that train have? That is ambiguous. It could mean how many people who are asleep, or it could mean how many cars which are devoted to sleeping does that train have. So in that case, actually, sleeper might get its own lexical entry because it has a totally different meaning which can't be predicted from the sum of the parts. Sleeper car would be a different meaning altogether than a person who is sleeping. A word, remember, is anything with spaces in between. Maybe it's something that gets a single primary stress. It's hard to actually define what words are. So even though I've been saying these things are words made of more than one morpheme, a lot of times technically linguists would say these are combinations of morphemes that come together. And then a lemma would be a set of those morpheme combinations, kind of i.e. the words, which could all be predictably derived from the root. So this group here would be a single lemma. So these are all of the words or morpheme combinations which are possible to derive based on this single morpheme walk. Walk, walking, walks, walked, walker, walkathon, walkaholic. Maybe you can think of some other ones. Maybe rewalk, if I rewalked the same territory. That could be an example of a form in the lemma. So we can also divide up morphemes into two groups. One group is sometimes called open class, sometimes called content morphemes. The reason we would call it open is because you can add new members to this very easily. It's very easy to invent in a language new members of the lexicon for these things. So this would be nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. I can invent a new noun fairly easily. I can invent a new verb fairly easily. I can invent a new adjective a little bit less easily, but it is possible. In English, these are all free morphemes, which mean they just kind of appear on their own. However, if there's a language like Russian or Spanish where the verb morpheme itself would be a stem, it has to have an ending in order to ever appear in the wild, it wouldn't be a free morpheme. It would be bound, which we'll talk about later. A second group would be the closed class. These are sometimes called function morphemes, whereas content, it's kind of a false distinction, but the idea of a content morpheme is that it's more communicating the main ideas, whereas a functional morpheme, it's more communicating just like subtle relationships. Closed class morphemes, it's a group of morphemes that it's very hard to invent a new one of. So these would be these morphemes that have a grammatical function, like a preposition. It's very difficult to invent a new preposition. Languages kind of have that set already closed. like in, of, behind, above, about, and you can't really make a new one. Or conjunctions like but, yet, and, or. I can't invent a new conjunction very easily. Articles like the, a, an, or these affixes, sort of the prefixes and suffixes that are possible in a language. And these affixes actually we'll see in another lesson next week, that they can perform lots of different roles, inflection or derivation. We'll talk about that more next week. Now, even though I said we can't really easily add new members to this group, we have actually added new prepositions recently. We can think of the newest preposition in English as maybe via. Like I went to London via Paris. Some people would say there's actually even a newer one, that because is starting to be used as a preposition now. So something like, I had an amazing night tonight because ice cream. Or, I can't go out with you tonight because homework. Some people would say that's ungrammatical. It certainly is a change to the English language. But we're using that word because as if it were a preposition instead of its traditional role. A conjunction, they do say there's a new conjunction that's been added to the English language, which is the one slash. I'm a singer / songwriter, or I'm going to run / walk to the store. So that's something that's part of informal speech, and it seems to be a new grammatical conjunction that got added to the language. I can prove to you that even though you may not be consciously aware of your knowledge of morphology, these combinations of morphemes, you actually do have expert knowledge, at least in the language that you were born with. So here I have this alien. What do I call this thing? Well, I don't have a word for it yet. I mean, I have a word alien, but I could actually invent a new one. Remember, we can make up new morphemes if we want to. I could say that this is a Zoxor. And I could say that these then would be two Zoxors, and I would put a plural S. So I have Zoxor, Zoxor, and then I have a Zoxor and Zoxors. So A would be one morpheme, Zoxor would be another, and this plural S would be another. What are they doing? I could say that they're fooving. So that ing is this progressive meaning. Foov would be the action of what they were just doing there. What did the Zoxors just do? They fooved. So what you see here is like these black ones are open class morphemes, and then these red things are affixes. They're function morphemes. They give you more of a relationship about this open class, this content morpheme there. So the plural S is a closed class morpheme, and new plural endings can't be created. So any new word that comes into English is going to use that same plural morpheme. Same with the past tense D and fooved. This is a closed class morpheme, a function morpheme. I can't make up a new past tense form in English. I can make up a new noun, I can make up a new verb, but I can't make up a new past tense morpheme. So any new verb in English will automatically use that same past tense morpheme that's kind of ready to go. It's an agreed upon thing. The language doesn't want to innovate in that way. So closed class morphemes, prepositions, articles, conjunctions, really anything that serves a grammatical function that's not one of those content morphemes, the nouns, the verbs, the adjectives, and adverbs. So bound and free, bound is sort of what it sounds like. It has to be attached to another morpheme. It can't ever be pronounced on its own in the wild, in actual language. So this example of the D in English, which is the past tense marker, is a great example of this. I can't just say, did you walk? D. It means like past tense. Or when did you walk? D. I can't communicate that. Like this D can only ever appear once it's attached to another root. Same thing with aholic. I can't say, what is he? He's an aholic. It can't appear on its own, this ending which means an addict of whatever thing it attaches to. Or re. You say, did you play that song? Re, which meaning I played it again. No, you can't ever play it. I can say I replayed it. You can attach it to another root, but it can't ever appear on its own. Free morphemes can appear by themselves. So in English, almost all of our morphemes are actually free. We have a very small group of bound morphemes, but there's lots of languages. Turkish is an example, Russian is an example, where free morphemes are actually the minority and bound morphemes are the majority of morphemes which are in the language. And you can see in this chart I've kind of divided it up between free morphemes and bound in one direction and open and closed in the other. So let's start down here. This is kind of the one that makes the most sense to us. I have an adjective bold, which can occur on its own. I have dodge, which could be a verb. I could use it as a noun to talk about the car. I have a dodge, or cat. So these are words that can appear on their own. They're nouns, verbs, adjectives. They're things that are open class. It's easy to make up a new one of these, or fairly easy to do that. Closed free morphemes. So these would be categories like via is a preposition. How is this kind of question word, which I can't make new question words in the language very easily. More is an adverb, which would modify an adjective or something that's more disturbing than something else. These are closed. They're free. They can appear on their own. They don't have any endings, prefixes, or suffixes, but they perform a function. Bound and closed, these are, English doesn't really like these, but actually there's lots of other languages that use them all of the time. Like, it's uber simple, meaning it's very simple. I can't actually use uber in this meaning where it would attach to something on its own. If I use it on its own, then I'm using a different uber, which happens to have the same pronunciation, which would be actually a free open morpheme, which would mean kind of a car that's being run by the app Uber. But like uber tired or uber worthy. There's actually this kind of strange thing in some word game varieties of English where I can put is into the middle of the word to make something stronger, like house could become like his house. And we have these other ones, again, these are very rare in the world's languages, but especially rare in English. These are kind of really the only two I can think of that are bound, but are content. So kempt seems to mean something like an adjective in a word like unkempt. So unkempt hair means like hair that's not very tidy. So the un means not. The kempt means something like tidy or put together, but actually I can never use kempt on its own. I can only ever use kempt as part of that word unkempt. So it's bound, but seems like an open content morpheme, like an adjective. Or cran in the word cranberry, I can't actually use that on its own. I can never pronounce cran, but I can have cranberry, and I can have like cran apple or cran grape or cran orange. So it's contributing some kind of a content meaning to this. It's not a grammatical meaning, it's a real meaning, but it doesn't appear on its own. You know, I can't say, what are you drinking? Oh, I'm drinking cran.